A woman spent a staggering £10,000 for a bowl of dumplings, only to find them revoltingly fishy and inedible. Why? Because these dumplings were made from human placentas. Supposedly, consuming them could restore her youthful vitality. Strangely enough, something so off-putting that even dogs would turn their noses up at it had become a firm favorite among wealthy socialites. The reason? The dumpling vendor herself was the living proof of its supposed magic. Would you believe that the woman, known as Aunt May, was already in her 60s? This so-called eternal youth which, Aunt May, was frequently spotted loitering around maternity wards. Back then, the strong preference for boys meant countless women were undergoing abortions every day. Aunt May seized this opportunity, purchasing placentas at high prices from willing doctors. Back home, she would soak them in ginger water for 2.5 hours to remove the stench and prepare them for consumption. Raw placentas, she claimed, were her secret to never aging. The rumor of Aunt May's youthful secret soon caught the attention of Mrs. Lee, a wealthy socialite. In her younger years, Mrs. Lee had been a film star. At 20, she married a man in his 40s, a tycoon. She left the spotlight to live as a pampered housewife. But as the years passed, Mrs. Lee's youthful glow faded. She became a yellow-faced woman, a Chinese term for an aging wife neglected by her husband. Mr. Lee, no longer interested in her, avoided intimacy entirely, limiting their relationship to a monthly allowance of millions. After all, as the saying goes, men are consistent in one thing, their eternal preference for 20-year-olds. While Mr. Lee flirted openly with his young secretary, Mrs. Lee could do nothing but watch in bitter silence. Desperate to reclaim her youth and win back her husband's attention, she turned to Aunt May for help. Aunt May prepared the placenta dumplings by mincing the placenta with pork, cabbage, and eggs for flavor. After boiling the mixture, she served them to Mrs. Lee. Nervously, Mrs. Lee took a cautious bite but was immediately repulsed by the stench, nearly vomiting. Even her pet husky sniffed the dumplings and recoiled. Seeing Mrs. Lee hesitate, Aunt May urged her, "Mrs. Lee, don't think about how it's made. Think about what it can do for you." The words hit Mrs. Lee where it hurt the most. Determined to regain her husband's heart, she forced herself to swallow the dumplings, the grotesque crunching sound making the experience even more unsettling. Halfway through the meal, Mrs. Lee began sweating profusely, and her skin took on a rosier glow. From that day forward, she became a regular customer, while Aunt May continued her shady business of acquiring ingredients from hospitals. After half a month of these bizarre treatments, Mrs. Lee's complexion indeed improved. However, she was still far from rivaling the beauty of 20-somethings. Her husband remained indifferent, using business trips as an excuse to spend time with his secretary.